We're going to continue in our sermon series on Father Abraham. We started this just a couple of weeks ago. This series will take us through through May and all the way to the end of June. And I'm excited about that. We're going to be working through this story of Abram and eventually Abraham when his name changes, which is Genesis chapters 12 through into the 20s we're going to cover. And so you can be caught up with us. If you've missed the last couple of weeks and you want to understand where we're going, you can go back and catch the sermons on our YouTube channel. They're all there. Today, I want to kick us into a section of the text that we're going to be looking at. And this week I've been spending some time thinking about transformation and what it looks like. I don't know if anybody has had the opportunity to visit some very beautiful places in our state, or at least connected to our state, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. These are immense and beautiful water reservoirs that are up on the Nevada and the Utah border here in Arizona. And they did not exist 100 years ago. There would have been just a canyon in those places. But through the miracles of modern engineering, we've dammed rivers and we've saved water so that we can live in a place like this in the desert. Now, if you've ever had the chance to visit one of these places, there is an experience that you will have if you do, where you stand on the shore of one of these lakes and you look out and it feels timeless, like it's always been like this and it always will be like this. But what we don't see is that it's actually changing all the time. In fact, over the last 20 years, it was 20 years ago, 2005, was the last time that either of these reservoirs were at its full capacity. Right now, they're both operating at about 35% of fill. That means on average, they're down 150 feet from where they normally are. That's why you have this very nice fancy bathtub ring around both of them. And if you had the ability to have a time-lapse video of the last 20 years, you're going to see the immense change that these places have went through as the water level goes down and up and down and up and down and up and kind of always on a trend down is what we've experienced as we went through this drought. And as I was thinking about that this week, I was thinking how much that feels a lot like our lives as Christians. And in particular on Mother's Day, I think you see it as a parent. If you have kids or you've raised kids, you know that there can be moments in life where you think, this is really hard. Are they always going to be this annoying? Is that thing that they do ever going to stop? And yet, when you talk to another parent, all you're actually asking for is a reminder from outside of yourself, don't worry, this is going to change too. And if you don't believe me, just go back and look at last year's Mother's Day photo of you and your family, and you'll see how much they've changed over the last year. It can be shocking. We almost never get the opportunity in our own lives to get a zoomed out time-lapse video of the change that has happened to us as Christians. If you've been following Jesus for a long time in your life, you are, through the transformation of God's Spirit in your life, a vastly different person than you once were, but it can feel discouraging, like nothing's changing today. And one of the things that we get in this section of Genesis that we're going to head into today is the gift of being able to see someone's life over long periods of time. There's a real temptation that happens when you read sections of narrative stories out of the Bible like this, that you go, thing one happened, followed by thing two, followed by thing three, and that must have all happened in the course of 3 months or something. And the reality is, today we're going to end up, we're some 8 years, by many scholars' estimate, from the time that Abram left his homeland to go out to the Promised Land. 8 years is a long time, and a lot of things are going to change over the next 8 years of your life. And so hopefully as we look at Abram, what we're going to see is some of the things that are changing in his life. This is the way Bill Gates says it. We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And one of the gifts that we get in Abram's life is seeing a long period of a man's life and the transformation that happens to him over that period of time. Just as a reminder, we kind of are using a framing device as we work through this story of Abram, of the people of Israel being released from slavery and captivity in Egypt, heading out into the desert, And around the campfire and under the stars there in the desert, the elders of the Israelite people have gathered around, and Moses is telling them through their oral history, who are we and where did we come from, and who is this God who loves us, and who is our Father, and where are we going? And that's kind of what we see here today. Just as a reminder of what we've been through, at the very beginning of this story, we have a man named Abram who's part of a successful ranching and shepherding family, and he is called by God to leave his home, his country, his family, his father, and go to a place that he's never been, but that God promises he will give him and show him. Last week, that story developed, and it's going to be really hard for me to summarize what happened last week because it's got some weird twists and turns. If you missed it, you should go listen to it. But short story is this: a famine comes into the land, and Abram, in order to save his family, goes down to Egypt for food, and he gets involved in a very weird situation where he lies about his wife being his sister, and his wife is kidnapped by the Pharaoh and brought into her harem, and eventually a curse comes on him. And what the text tells us is that Pharaoh's official saw Sarai, his wife, and she was so beautiful, he kidnaps her and brings her into his harem, and then he blesses Abram with all kinds of things as a gift. And then a curse comes upon Pharaoh, and he sends him out. The text says Pharaoh gave orders about Abram and his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. He said, "Get the heck out of here." And Abram then leaves and heads out back into the desert to the place where he was originally called. And that's where we're going to be today. I've had a couple awkward weeks. Like the first 2 weeks in this series, I've been trying to do an entire sermon on like 10 verses of Abram's story. And there's a distinct challenge that comes with that, like enough ideas and content around these just few verses. And today I have the exact opposite problem because we're going to be working through all of chapters 13 and 14 today. And moms, because it's Mother's Day, I know the one thing you were really hoping for was a good old-fashioned war story, so that's what I have for you today. I know how much moms love war stories, so that's what we have today. Let's get started. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Here's what it says. This is directly following the story of what happened when they were in Egypt. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, the desert, with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock, in silver, and in gold. What happens when he's in Egypt is Pharaoh takes his wife, who he believes is Abram's sister, and in order to compensate him for his loss, he gives him all kinds of gifts. He gives him livestock and money. And there's this interesting thing that's happening as we hear the stories of Abram, because the audience who's hearing it is understanding how these are echoes of their own story. Just as an example, we said, here's the Israelites post-slavery around the campfire listening to these stories. Let's see if this would ring a bell for them. Remember, here is Abram. Pharaoh took something that did not belong to him. God cursed Pharaoh with a plague, and then Pharaoh said, "Get out of here and take all these goods with you." Now let's look at Exodus chapter 13. Here's what the Israelites experienced. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and your Israelites." And then the text tells us later, the Israelites asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and clothing. And the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. I love this. God essentially convinced all the Egyptians that when these slaves that have brought plagues upon you leave, they're going to ask you for something. Just give them everything they want. And so they plunder the Egyptians, and they go out to the desert, a people without a home, but with many riches. Sounds a lot like their story they're hearing of Abram. It continues. The text says, now remember, Lot is the nephew of Abram, who he brought with him on this adventure. It says, now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. I just want to pause for a second right here because we need to remember there is a cultural reality to what is going on. Lot is the nephew of Abram, and in any Bronze Age cultural moment, the father of the household, which Abram would have been, would have had claim and ownership over everyone and everything in his household. So the fact that it tells us that Lot had his own flocks and herds and tents already tells us something about Abram. Abram is a generous man. He has allowed Lot to develop his own household within his household. Okay, and then it says, but the problem is the land couldn't support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. Why is that important? Because it tells us that they're hemmed in. They're trying to fit in between enemy camps that have claim over the land, and Abram and Lot and all their stuff only have so much room, and it's causing issues. We don't know where to send our herds to graze. They're fighting with each other. What do we do about it? And before we move on, I just want to make an observation, and I think it's really apt in our current day and age, and it's this. Sometimes too much becomes a problem to be solved. And I think it's really important for us to stop for a moment and acknowledge this, because we live in a moment in a cultural time in which it feels like the answer to almost every problem anyone has is more. How many times I have heard families who are struggling relationally, and one of the reasons that they would tell me that they're struggling relationally is they're struggling with money. If you ask counselors what is the most fight-inducing issue in marriages, it's arguments over money. And we often think that the answer to the problems that we have, we're arguing what we just need is more money so we have more looseness in our budget. What we really need is more money so we can vacation together more. Our kids aren't getting along. What we actually need is a bigger house so that they can each have their own room. The car is causing us, what we actually need is each of us to have our own car. My work is not fulfilling. What I actually need is a new promotion. And here's the deal, God has blessed Abram, and I would hate to say that these aren't good things and that they're not a blessing, but they oftentimes bring a problem that suddenly now needs to be solved. More isn't always the answer, and more doesn't always make things easier. In fact, sometimes it creates issues of its own. And that's what we see here in Abram's life. So what does Abram say? Remember, Abram is the father of the house. He's the oldest. He has rule and the right rule over everything under him. And so Abram could just solve this problem clearly and harshly and say, you know what, the problem is, your stuff is getting in my way, that's my stuff now. But that's not what Abram says. He says to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and my herders, for we're close relatives, we're bros. We're family, we're kin, we're blood. Isn't the whole land before you? Let's part company. This will be the solution. We're going to peacefully split up. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. That's the solution. It's going to be easy. And what we're seeing in Abram is what I think real growth and transformation. The story we just heard is him going down to Egypt and being nervous about his own provision and protection. He risks his wife in order to protect and provide for himself. And now in the next story, we see him willing to give up on behalf of Lot. And so what does Lot do? Lot looks around and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar, which was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Now I just want to note this. There's a little parentheses here, because the audience who's hearing it, sitting around the campfire, was like, wait, I know the place you're talking about. Well watered like a garden of the Lord. That place is a wasteland. And so he says, oh yeah, but that's before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh, okay, that makes sense to me. I see why it looked good then, not so much now. So Lot chooses for himself the plain of the Jordan. He sets out toward the east, and the two men parted company. Now, if you're a parent, and if you're in the process of, there's a lot of wonderfully pregnant ladies in the congregation. I've seen lots of brand new babies around, which is awesome. You're going to have to learn what it looks like to parent. Here's a tip for you. It's called the I cut, you choose method. So there's going to come a moment when your two kids have one candy bar, and they want to decide, how are we going to share the candy bar? And here's what you do. One of the kids cuts the candy bar in half, and the other kid gets to get the first choice of which part of the candy bar they want. Why do we do this? Because we motivate the kid to make a fair choice, because the last thing he wants is to get hosed out of more of the candy bar. And Abram does the same thing. Now, keep in mind, he doesn't have to do this. Cultural norms say this is not what Abram has to do. In fact, Abram could say we should split up, and he could send him wherever he wants. You need to get out of here. But he doesn't. He says, you split, you choose, to Lot. You cut the candy bar, and you pick which part of the candy bar you want. And what does Lot do? Well, I think what a lot of us would do. I know with my brother, this is what I would have done. I would have surveyed the land, and I would have looked for the place that looked the best, and I'd say, that's a good idea. I'll take the best spot over there. And that's what Lot does. He says he goes down to the place that's watered like the Garden of Eden, like Egypt itself. It's a wonderful place in the southern part of the country, and the two men part company. Here's what I think we can learn from Abram right here. Our position comes with rights that we don't have to demand. There's a bunch of responsibility and benefits and privileges and rights that Abram would have had as the senior member of his household, culturally normative, for him to get the best land, for him to claim all of the stuff, for him to tell Lot, knock it off or you're out of here, but he does none of it. In fact, what we see him doing is opening his hands in generosity and saying, I'm going to send you with all of your things, which are really my things, and I'm going to let you go to whatever part of the land you choose, and you can take the best of it, and Lot does. And I love this because what we're seeing in Abram is a changing in his personality, the things he does instinctively. We're seeing growth. We're seeing transformation. We're seeing sanctification in Abram's life because he's becoming more like Jesus. Here's what the letter to the church in Philippi, as written by the Apostle Paul, says. He tells the church that we should have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Paul tells us that as we're being transformed to look more like Jesus, it doesn't mean we will have no rights, privileges, or power. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that the rights, privileges, and power that you have, you don't have to demand that everyone bows to those things. Because look at Jesus. He was God, and yet he did not count his equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he used it to bless the world. And we're starting to see Abram behave in this kind of way. It's pretty incredible. This is what it tells us. So Abram then stayed in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities on the plain down south and pitched his tents near Sodom. You don't have to be around the church that much to hear that and go, wait, is there something about that city? Yes. And Abram lets you know. Moses, in telling the story, lets us know. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Probably 15 years ago, I was a much younger man then, and we were in our first house as a married couple. And we had a big lawn in the front. We had kind of an oddly shaped lot, and we had a big lawn in the front. And I was very proud of our lawn, and it was green, and I was out there mowing it all the time. And there was a day I came home from work, and it really needed to get mowed. And I was like, hey, I'm going to get out there and mow that lawn. And so I go out, and I'm very proud of this green, lush lawn out front. And I mow a lap around the lawn, and then I do the second lap, and I'm viciously attacked by a beehive that has been set up now in our little cable box next to the edge of the lawn. Everybody's got one of those in their front yard. They just come at me. They're Africanized killer bees. I have no idea if that's true, but it felt like it in the moment, because they're just stinging me and I'm being attacked. And it made me think of that when I read this, because this is what I think we can see here. The greener grass might be right next to a hornet's nest. And what I see in Lot is Lot makes the same consideration we all make. He looks and he says, boy, it looks green, it looks easy, it looks like I could become wealthy, it looks like I could be comfortable over there. And what he doesn't consider is who's there and what kind of influence will be in that place. And I interact with people a lot who will come to me and they'll say, hey, I have this opportunity for new work, as an example. And there's two questions that I hear people ask almost immediately about a new job. And it's these two questions. Is it a promotion? And are you going to get paid more? And it kind of feels like you start with those questions because if the answer is yes, it's a promotion, and yes, I'm going to get paid more, it's like, well, what are we even talking about? Yes, you take it. What we don't often ask is, where is it going to take you? What's it going to cost you? Oh, not much. I'm just going to have to travel 3 weeks out of the month, and I'm going to have to work 20 hours a week more, and we're going to have to move across the country away from my family and our church community. I'm not sure how much promotion and more money factors into that kind of equation, because I think one of the things that we have to be asking is, what is in the place you're going, and what will support you, and who will support you? Are you going to be inside of God's will? One of the things that the text tells us is that Lot, when he went to this place that looks so hopeful, what he actually does is go outside of the bounds and the borders of what God had promised Abram to give to him. The question we have to ask ourselves is this inside God's will for me? Now, the next question you might be asking is, that's a hard thing to figure out. And I go, yes, it is. That's why you need your family. That's why you need a community. That's why you need a church that can help you to discern these things. And if the only thing we're measuring is it a promotion and will I get more money, you might end up moving to green grass right next to a hornet's nest. And that's what Lot does. This is how the Proverbs say it. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end leads to death. And we're going to see what happens to Lot here in the next part of this chapter, because we jump into the end tells us what God does here. The Lord says to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, God comes to Abram and speaks to him again. And this is what he says, look around from where you are. Look to the north and to the south. Look to the east and look to the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could also be counted. Go walk through the length and the breadth of the land that I'm giving to you. It might seem like an odd thing for God to suddenly show up and say in this moment, but I feel like it's really appropriate, because what I'm hearing in this moment is God knowing what Abram is feeling. Let's just step back for a second and humanize the man named Abram and what has happened in this moment. He's standing on the land that does not yet belong to him. There's so little land that he had to separate from his beloved nephew. He's watched his nephew wander off with all of his family down into this plain. He has believed, I think, that Lot is the descendant who will give him a future. And right then, in the moment of doubt, in the moment of fear, in the moment of wondering, did I mess this whole thing up when I went down to Egypt? Did I screw it up? Is God going to forget about me? God shows up, because this is true. God meets you right where you find yourself. The questions that Abram is wrestling with are the questions that God answers. Here's what he says. I have not forgotten about you. My promise still stands. Everything you can see will become yours. And even though Lot, the one you thought would carry on your family line, is gone, I am still going to promise and fulfill the promise that you will have more descendants than you can believe. Because God hears and he sees and he knows you and he knows your heart, and he wants to remind you of the promises that he's made to you, especially when you're in a dark place wondering if he's still there. Last week was May the 4th. And I heard from many of you, and when I say many, I mean many of you, how shocked, dismayed, and disappointed you were that I did not make Star Wars references last week. And I have to be honest, it did require a lot of restraint on my part. But if there's one thing I don't want to be, is be cliche. And I would have really had to shoehorn it in, and you were all expecting it, and so therefore you wanted me to zig, and I zagged. But the real honest thing is, it's because I knew this story was coming, and what we get this week is a rebel alliance and the empire striking back. I needed to wait because it's happening this week. Okay, here's what chapter 14 tells us. Now, we've worked through most of the text of chapter 13. We're gonna bounce a little bit through chapter 14 because it's got a bunch of big names and weird places, but we'll do our best to get through it. Here's what it says, and I know you want to be impressed by my ability to read all these weird names, so I'm going to do it for you once, and then we're going to kind of gloss over it from there. Here's what it says, starting in chapter 14, verse 1. At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedolamar, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shenab, king of Admah, Shember, king of Zoyabim, and the king of Bela. Okay, so just to summarize for you very quickly, I've underlined the important part. These kings went to war against them kings, okay? So you kind of got the summary. Here's what it says. The latter kings, the ones at the bottom part of the list, had joined forces in the valley of Siddim. For 12 years, they had been subject to Kedolamar, who's up in the top part of the list, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. In fact, you might say they created a rebel alliance against the king. So here's kind of the way it worked. One of the things I talked about last week is I love archaeological references that can help us validate and anchor things in the Bible. But when you're back this far in Abram's story, there's a lot of stuff that it's just hard to find the connections. And part of it is records are very thin. These cities have been wiped off the planet 6-7 times over. Names have changed. Languages have been lost. It's hard to find. And if you want an example of this, you can go find a really heavy-duty commentary on this section and try to get them to tell you where these things are. There's very few of them that they can anchor. Sodom and Gomorrah, they can, but most of the other ones, they're kind of guessing. But here's the summary of what the scholars say. You have a regional king that is up in Mesopotamia, where Abram and his family originally came from, where Babylon and Ur, the big cities, are, and they have rule over this entire region down in Canaan, where the Canaanites and these cities are. And being under that rule meant that you had to submit to them, you had to pay taxes, you had to give homage to the kings, and they were sick of taxation with no representation. And so they got together at one of their regional city-state meetings, and they said, are you guys sick of paying taxes to the man? Because I'm sick of paying taxes to the man. What do you say we all band together and we rebel? It's kind of the idea. So you have big regional kings up there, and down here, they also call them kings, but you can really think about them as like mayors. It'd be like the mayor of Gilbert and the mayor of Chandler and the mayor of Tempe and the mayor of Mesa all got together, and they're like, are you guys sick of being part of the Phoenix Metro? We're out. And if they want to say anything about it, we're aligned together. We're part of the rebel alliance in the East Valley. Because we're sick of being under the thumb. That's what the text tells us what happens. And then it says, I love that it just cuts to this, they marched out and they drew their battle lines in the valley of Siddim. 4 kings against 5 kings. Here is the war I promised you, moms. Are you ready? There's a moment that happens when the empire says, that's not how it works. You don't just get to rebel against us. We're going to bring the armies down there and we're going to put you in line. And they show up and it all starts to melt down. Where does it happen? It actually happens that what it tells us is that it's in the valley of Siddim, which is another name for the Dead Sea and that region around it. Down in the southern part of Israel, and in fact, the battlefield was probably on the southern end of the lake. There's a big plain out there, and they go to battle in this spot. That's what the text tells us. And it says that the battle doesn't last very long. In fact, when the empire's forces show up, they start whipping tail, and they all start running. It says, now in the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, they don't even include the part where they tried to fight. It just says they started running for the hills. Some of the men fell into the tar pits, and the rest of them escaped up into the hills. And the 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their food, and then they went away. They're making an example of them. It's interesting, it says that these tar pits are here. Here's one of the things that we can actually validate, because even today there are tar pits. There are deep fissures in the earth right in this area that allow oil and tar to bubble up. And there's this interesting thing that happens in the bottom of the Dead Sea. That oil and tar bubbles up, interacts with the water content of the Dead Sea, which is uniquely heavy in minerals and salt content, and it creates what we know as asphalt. Asphalt was actually discovered and created thousands of years ago because of these tar pits bubbling up in the Dead Sea, creating these weird sticky masses that would roll up to the side of the beach, and the empires would grab them and they would pave streets and stuff with it. That's how we got asphalt. And it tells us that when the battle broke out, they took off running and they started getting stuck in the asphalt and the tar pits, and they tried to escape. And they made an example of them. They said, just in case anyone else wants to try something like this in the past, I'm going to take all your treasure and all your food. Good luck surviving out there. And then they leave. Well, the text adds one little thing. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. They were right next door, and they got swept up in the middle of the war. But a man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. You might say that Lot was taken. That's Liam Neeson, if you've never seen the movie Taken. Liam Neeson is an ex-CIA operative, a man with a special set of skills, and his daughter is on a backpacking trip in Europe, and she gets kidnapped by bad dudes in Europe. And they call Liam Neeson and they say, we have your daughter and we want a ransom in order for protect her. And he says, essentially, this is the worst mistake you've ever made, and I will hunt you down and end you. I've been really loving trying to learn about Abram and all this stuff. This is my favorite part so far. Because Abram goes from this kind of like nebulous shepherd guy who's making weird decisions, and suddenly he becomes this like really impressive CIA operative. Because this is what it tells us happens. He gets the call. Abram, your boy Lot just got kidnapped in a war, and they took him off in the spoils of battle. And Abram turns to his crew and he says, that's not the section, it's this one. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. The empire's armies, the assembled empire's armies, came to town, kicked butt, took everybody with them, including Lot, and Abram says, round up the boys, we got a job to do, let's go. Now, this is the nerdy stuff that I really get into, because when I read 318 men, the first thing I think is, I bet that gives us a statistical sampling of how many people were in Abram's household. Because if we can figure out what percentage of people would have been of men of able fighting age, we can deduce how big his family is. And then I pushed up my glasses and snorted. But just for your benefit, estimates are in a Bronze Age family like this, some 20 to 25% of the people in the household would have been men of fighting age. Therefore, we can estimate that Abram's household is somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 people. It's big. And he says, strap on your walking sandals and grab your sword, because we're going to get our boy Lot. And they take off and they chase him. It says as far as Dan. This is some 200 miles north of where they are right now. They're following the cloud of dust that the army is leaving behind them as they take off. And you wonder, how in the world is Abram going to do anything at all with 300 dudes against the empire's army? And you have underestimated how awesome Abram is, because here's what they do. They risk it all to go get him. This is the thing I think we need to learn from Abram. Oftentimes, the right call is to set aside safety to pursue justice. Abram, in the last story, put his wife in peril in order to protect himself. And today, he puts himself in peril in order to rescue his nephew. I have two boys, Beck, who's here and is 13, Asher, who's going to be 18 in just a few months. And one of the things in raising boys that you end up getting to a point when you have to answer some questions, especially as a Christian, especially as a pastor, is, Dad, when's it okay to fight? And I answer like I'm supposed to, never, son. We've actually given some pretty simple rules. And here was the rule, in particular Asher as he was getting older. I said, here is the rule. If you're fighting to defend yourself, no. Jesus tells us we should turn the other cheek. And so if you are the one who's being picked on and being made fun of, you turn the other cheek and you walk away. But if you see someone doing that to someone else who's vulnerable, who's weak, who's on the outside, who's picked on all the time, it's your time to risk your neck to stand up for that person. And I'm telling you, if you come home telling me that you got in a fight because you were defending the defenseless kid in your class, I'm not only going to not get you in trouble, I might buy you ice cream. Because I think that is what we're called to do and what we see in Abram's life. When he's sacrificing the vulnerable to make himself protected, bad. When he's sacrificing his own safety in order to go after the vulnerable, good. Because that's what righteousness looks like, and it's what we see in Abram's life as he heads out with his crew going after an unwinnable fight of the empire's army. How do they do it? Well, a lot like Jesus did it. This is what Jesus says about his life. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? Jesus left the comfort, the safety, the predictability, the power of heaven to come to earth, not just to risk his life, but to willingly give it to rescue those of us who could not rescue ourselves. And in the story we see of Abram, we see an example of him living out the example of the life that our God has showed us, because he is the measure of righteousness, and we are moving in that way when we begin to emulate him. Here's what it says happens. During the night, they catch up with them. I want to see a movie about this, honestly. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobath, which is another 150 yards north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods, and he brought back his relative lot, his possessions, together with all the women and all the other people. He kicked their tail, sent them running, and comes back with his boy Lot, all their ladies, all their people, all their loot, all their goods, and he comes back home. A hero. I love this. I love this. And then something interesting happens. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom comes out to meet him in the valley of Sheva. That is the king's valley. So just to remember what has happened to the king of Sodom. He got his tail kicked by these kings. He ran for the hills. We know he survived. He didn't get killed, and he didn't get stuck in a tar pit. He was one of the guys that got up in the hills. And what has this king been left with? Well, they took all his people, and they took all his money, and they took all his food. He's defenseless, and he comes out to meet Abram. First of all, he's got to be impressed, because I know I am. Who is this guy? I got to meet him. So he comes out. And then it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. I just want to pause for a second here. One of the challenges of going through 2 chapters is there's a lot of content to get through. And if you've been around the church in your life, or if you've grown up in the church, you hear a name like Melchizedek and you go, wait, I think that guy's significant. And he is, because especially in Hebrews in the New Testament, it is mentioned that Jesus is a priest king in the line of Melchizedek. He's a priest king like Melchizedek. Now here's the thing, I don't have time to go into all that. So if you're part of the members community, this week my promise to you is I'll record a little thing with some extra nerdy stuff about this, and if you're interested, you can follow along. If you're not part of our members community, sign up for the next membership class. We'd love to have you be part of the members community here. This is what happens. Melchizedek comes out alongside the king of Sodom, and he brings bread and wine. And it says, he was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. The king of Sodom comes out because he wants to make an alliance with this powerful king. And then this mysterious king, from a place that has not yet been mentioned but is significant, Melchizedek, king of Salem, is important because Salem is the name of the city we know as Jerusalem. And he was the king of the city-state known as Jerusalem before Jerusalem was a city-state. And it tells us something else surprising. We can assume that Abram is the first and only one to know our God, the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And yet here, this king comes out, and he is a priestly king. And he brings out blessing to Abram's people. And he says, hey, Abram, I see what you did. And I want to bless you because God has blessed you. He's the one that delivered them into your hand. There's no other way to explain what has happened here. And if we remember the promise that God made to Abram, it was, I will bless you, and when people bless you, they will be blessed. What happens next? Abram gave this king a tenth of everything he came back with. He gives him all of these gifts as a return blessing, fulfilling the promise that God has already given. When people bless you, you will become a blessing to them. And here it is happening. And then I love this picture because I'm imagining this moment of intense worship of God and blessing each other. And then from behind them, the king of Sodom sticks his head out. Hey, I'm here. It's totally cool that you just gave him all that stuff because I got a deal for you anyway, Abram. You just give me the people that you brought back and you can keep all the goods for yourself, because why does the king of Sodom say this? He has no army left. He has no one to command to give him the power that he really desires. Right now, he's just a dude who lives in a ruined city. If you can just give me all the people, then I'll have what I need, which is somebody to command and to prop me up. You keep all the stuff, Abram. So it's totally fine. You just gave 10% of it to this dude. I don't even know who he is, but it's a good deal. And then Abram says this, and I love it. Abram says, with a raised hand, I've sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap on your sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I mean, this is a cold diss on this guy. He's like, I'm not going to take anything you give me because I promised God I would not be enriched by a dirtbag like you. Whew. That's cold. But what does it show us? It shows us the growth of a man named Abram. Just last week, we were telling a story about how he sacrificed his wife's safety in order to enrich himself from a foreign king. And now, just a few short years later, he looks this guy in the face and says, I've made an oath before God that I will not take anything from you because I'm not going to let you take the credit for what only God can do. And he gives him everything and walks away. Here's what I think we see in Abram that we need to learn. Righteousness grows in us when we begin to believe in and behave like the righteous one. What do we know about our God? He makes promises and he keeps them. What do we know about our God? He is generous. What do we know about our God? He does not defend his own rights in order to advantage himself. What do we know about our God? He sacrifices himself to save the vulnerable who can do nothing for themselves. That's the God we know. And what we see in Abram's life is a growth in righteousness as he begins to believe God's promises to him. And he begins to transform because he's becoming more and more like the God who has called him. This is what 2 Corinthians, Paul writes to the church in Corinth, and he uses this beautiful poetic language to talk about this transformation in your life and my life. He says, and we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image. I love this language. He says that we who have accepted the grace of Christ Jesus are a people living with unveiled faces. We don't wear a mask. We don't pretend to be something that we're not. When we acknowledge how helpless we are, how needy we are, that we have done nothing to achieve our own salvation, that only God is the one that can reach down and rescue us, when we stand before him with unveiled faces, and when we contemplate God's glory and what he's done for us, we begin to become transformed into his image. It's the call to transformation and sanctification, and it's what we see in the life of Abram. What we are watching is a man becoming what he is called to become. There is a calling in your life, just like there's a calling in Abram's life. In fact, the calling on Abram's life, I would argue, is the same calling you have, to be a priestly king in the order of Melchizedek, like our Jesus, in order to be generous and to be courageous and to be on mission and to bring the kingdom wherever we go. It's the call that we have, and you're not there yet. I'm not there yet, but righteousness will grow in us when we believe God's promises and when we begin to act more like the righteous one who has called us. And we are getting the benefit of seeing it in Abram's life as we walk through his story. Would you pray with me that God would help us to become those kinds of people? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for the story of Abram. Thank you for letting us get this zoomed out time lapse video of his life so that we can understand and learn what it looks like to become more and more of a believer in your promises. God, I pray this morning specifically for our moms who play such a key role in shaping the next generation of people who will be called upon to live with unveiled faces and to contemplate the glory of God, to be transformed into his image. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.